Welcome to Big Thinking. Bon après-midi et bienvenue à notre série de causeries Voix Grand. My name is Gabriel Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, which is the national voice of more than 90,000 researchers and graduate students. We are thrilled to be partnering for the first time today with the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. For just a quick show of hands, could people just let me know who's visiting from out of town today? That's terrific. It's wonderful to have you here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about why we're so excited to be working with the Academy. But first, I want to pay respects to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region from all nations across Canada. We are grateful to have the opportunity to exchange ideas on lands that have so much meaning and history. And as I learned preparing for today, I think there's a particular relevance of that history to today's topic. I want to call attention to the work of the Algonquin Anishinaabe elder, Grandfather William Commanda, a former chief of the Algonquin Nation from Kitigan-Zibi. Grandfather William Commanda founded a peace organization called the Circle of Nations, which had the aim, and I quote, of respecting everything that the Creator made. The idea of a Circle of Nations is an important one in the context of the recently released World Refugee Council report, A Call to Action, Transforming the Global Refugee System, which is based on the principle that all members of the international community must share the responsibility for supporting refugees and the countries that host them. I'm sure that you will agree the context of a federal election provides a timely backdrop for us to reflect on these issues. Je souhaite bien sûr remercier nos amis et partenaires du Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines. C'est en effet leur appui qui rend ces rassemblements possibles. Today's lecture is at once a kickoff to our partnership with the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and a kickoff to the Academy's annual forum, as different parts of our society come together to reflect on our respective roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis refugees. In the room today, we have representatives from government, embassies, research institutions, public libraries, IDRC, the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and other NGOs, making this a special opportunity for us all to collectively rethink leadership in the context of refugees. It is my great pleasure now to invite Dr. Linda Rabinek, President of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, to introduce this important organization and tell us something about its work.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Linda Rabinek, President of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. I want to welcome you all here to this inaugural public lecture of ours. We're thrilled to be partnering with Big Thinking. As Gabriel mentioned, tomorrow is our annual forum, our scientific forum, on the topic of refugee health, but we've not before had a public lecture preceding the annual forum, so we're very excited about this, thrilled to see the room filled for this event. I want to thank our co-chairs who've organized our forum for tomorrow. That's Dr. Philip Berger, Dr. Lawrence Kermeyer, and Dr. Meb Rashid, I should say, who have organized our forum for tomorrow, and it will be a terrific event. I now want to introduce Dr. Philip Berger, who's then going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Philip Berger is an associate professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. He served as medical director of the Inner City Health Program at St. Mike's from 1997 to 2017. He has helped establish human rights-related health organizations arising from his extensive work in the field with torture victims, with HIV-infected individuals, and many others. He currently serves as chair of the board of Inner City Health Associates, a group of 90 physicians who provide medical services for homeless people in Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Berger, who's then going to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. As you know, this afternoon is the launch of the annual Canadian Academy of Health Science Center Forum, which will take place tomorrow for CHS members. The Academy, with unusual resolve, is opening up the topic of refugee health and migrant health to the general public through this afternoon's lecture, and we could not find a more suitable speaker than the venerable Dr. James Orbinski. It's really a terrifying task to introduce Dr. Orbinski. His justifiably lengthy CV would unnerve anyone. After all, he's received dozens of the nation's highest awards and honors, including the Order of Canada. He was president of MSF from 1998 to 2001, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on its behalf in December 2009. He's a member of the prestige Lancet Medical Journal Commission on Arctic Health and has spoken at just about every international forum, including the United Nations on humanitarianism, Dr. Orbinski being the exemplar. He's known to leaders across the world, and they understandably fear his rage at abuse of power to hurt and kill others. James was born with a striking inclination to find himself in the midst of the extremes and worst of human behavior, and he has never backed away or fled. The practice and ethics of medicine represent a collision between self-interest and self-effacement. Dr. Orbinski has always fallen wholly and singularly on the latter. His fury at injustice has placed him in the line of fire, real gunfire, in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide, where he witnessed unspeakable atrocities and cared for the wounded and dying. Except Dr. Orbinski did speak out, and speak loudly, most notably through his best-selling 2008 memoir, An Imperfect Offering, the eponymous title of Dr. Orbinski's description of a 14-year-old Rwandan boy whose leg Dr. Orbinski amputated with a sterilized hacksaw in a life-saving operation. And to quote Dr. Orbinski, the boy's leg was in a bucket and he was alive, an imperfect offering. Dr. Orbinski began his career in 1987 as an HIV/AIDS researcher in Rwanda, and as is typical for him, he was amongst the first wave of scientists and doctors to dare confront the epidemic, especially in Africa. His first MSF mission in 1991 was in Peru, where within hours of his arrival, he was detained by a soldier of the same age as Dr. Orbinski. That would be the first of many perilous moments in Dr. Orbinski's humanitarian life, as over the decades he has made his way through war and disease-ravaged neighborhoods in Somalia, South Africa, Zambia, Zaire, Sudan, and Malawi, in the latter establishing a world-renowned community-based antiretroviral HIV/AIDS treatment network. Now, Dr. Orbinski seems to have a near genetic predisposition to find himself in spots where trouble is at a boil. On September 11th, 2001, at precisely 8:20 in the morning, his plane landed at Newark Airport in New Jersey. And as he rode in the cab to the Manhattan UNICEF building, the second plane hit the Twin Towers. Dr. Orbinski then volunteered as a triage doctor in Hoboken, New Jersey, for those wounded who could be transported to the triage center. Dr. Orbinski, through all this trauma and high profile, has sustained a keen sense of anonymous generosity. We worked together at Toronto St. Michael's Hospital in 2004 to 2012. I was chief of the Department of Family and Community Medicine, and as a physician staff member, James, well, allegedly reported to me. We had an appointment once for which she was 15 minutes late. I asked the administrative assistant with whom I worked, "Where's Orbinski?" As it happened, she had just peered through our office window to the street below, where she observed James in an animated discussion with a homeless person to whom James had just doled out some cash. That is Dr. Orbinski, kind and engaging in a quiet form of justice which nobody except the homeless person could see. Please welcome the very public, the fearless, and sometimes the quietly gracious Dr. James Orbinski.
Well, thank you, Philip, for an incredibly kind and gracious introduction. I will say that when I was a medical student in 1986, just before I set off on a Medical Research Council of Canada and IDRC fellowship to Rwanda to study HIV/AIDS and engage in some research around clinical case definitions of HIV at that time, as a medical student, I went to a conference in Toronto. And it was a conference on, it was a very, very typically dry but extremely important academic conference on the little explored but extremely important pathophysiology of HIV. And you will remember that in 1986, very little was known. There were gathered a group of probably about 300 or 400 really august and serious scientists, bench scientists mostly, who were making various presentations on the pathophysiology of HIV/AIDS. Philip was the first in Toronto to open or to actively seek out and then open a practice at the Wellesley Hospital for people with HIV in Toronto. And he was doing a presentation at this particular conference. And he marked me then when he began his presentation by putting a candle on the podium, lighting the candle, and asking every scientist in the room to remember and to honor those who had died of HIV, and to remember and to honor through their work and through the judicious and appropriate application of their mind, their time, and their energy into their research, to pursue science for the sake of the good. It was a profound moment for me, and it has always stayed with me, and it always comes to mind whenever I have the great pleasure of being with Philip, which is often. We manage to have a dinner or two together every couple of months. This morning, or this afternoon, I should say, I want to bring you on a bit of an odyssey, and I want to address the global health perspectives on forced migration and health. Now, tomorrow, most people here will be participating in a scientific conference, and that will really focus on the clinical and public health, applied clinical and public health issues around the health of people who are forcibly moved from one circumstance to another. What I'd like to do today, over the next 40 or so minutes, is really talk about the broader global forces and factors that drive global migration. I want to talk about inequality. I want to talk about urbanization and population growth, populism and authoritarianism, a changing world order, regionalization of conflict, the impacts of major factors like climate change and ecological degradation. That's a lot to cover, but I am going to bring you on what I can only describe as an odyssey as we consider these issues. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. Can I control the slides from here? Okay. And where do I point? Do I point to you? Okay. Okay, that's not working. Oh, I see. Okay, hang on. Let me do it, okay? Okay, that's good. Okay. So, migration, there are more than 1 billion people on the planet who are moving or who have moved in the last year alone. Migration is part of the human process. It's what we do. There are 7.6 billion people on the planet today. And so when a billion of us have moved or are moving, it speaks to a phenomenon that is really part of how we choose to live, work, and organize ourselves as human beings. That process is accelerating because of the impacts of globalization, most especially over the last 30 years. And of those 1 billion people, 258 million, or about 25%, move across borders. So that means that about 75%, or 750 million, actually move within their country. We are concerned with a subset of that 258 million. The subset that we're actually concerned with are those who are forced to migrate, refugees and people who are internally displaced within their own country. There are 22 million refugees today, people who have crossed a border, who have been forced to cross a border, and there are 40 million people who are internally displaced, people who have moved from one place to another within their own territorial state, but who have been forced by dint of circumstance or by dint of threat to move from one place to another within their own domestic territory. At the same time, there are 141 million, which includes the 62 million refugees and IDPs. There's 141 million people around the world today who are in need of humanitarian assistance. That's food, medicine, water, shelter, by dint of their particular circumstances. That's the highest level since the end of that's the highest number since the end of World War II. And what we know is that migration, I'm going to read this directly, migration is not exclusively a human rights issue. There are economic aspects and, for some, security issues. It sits in the middle of clashes of some very potent political forces. Now, Louise Arbour made that statement, and that is, she is always, and always has been, the master of understatement in some circumstances, and that's a perfect example. When we're talking about migration, when we're talking about the health and well-being of people who've been forced to migrate, we are talking about what are fundamentally political issues. There is no way to address the issues of the rights and health needs of people who are refugees or who are internally displaced without broaching and without encountering and in some cases confronting political powers and ideologies that in many circumstances create the very causes and conditions in which people find themselves either refugees or internally displaced. You cannot avoid politics. And I think that is a fundamental issue that I think, particularly for an august group like this of academics and intellectuals, policy people, who often think that somehow there's a neutral space where science and policy and evidence-based practice itself is value neutral. When it comes to refugees, when it comes to internally displaced people, there is no such thing as avoiding the politics of power. And again, that's sometimes through encounter, sometimes through process and dialogue, but in many cases it must be through confrontation. We are now at a point where 141 million people around the world, including refugees and IDPs, are in need of humanitarian assistance. And this is increasing. And this number is increasing as a consequence of a number of forces and factors that are very much the defining features of our 21st century and of our second decade now in the 21st century. As I've mentioned, 1 billion people move or have moved in 2018. 250 million of those people are economic migrants. 22 million are refugees and 40 million are displaced. You can see from the graph, from roughly 1955 when data was first collected, you can see from the graph that there are peaks and valleys and spikes, and you can see overall that the number is increasing. And that's a consequence, again, of changing social, political, and economic structures, and of changing broader contextual variables like global governance, climate change, environmental degradation, and so on, some of which I will touch on now. What we know, however, is that there are a number of myths around migration that really do need to be clearly dispelled. The first is that high-income countries are not. High-income countries are actually not being overwhelmed by migrants. The vast majority of migration takes place in the developing world, or in the southern part of the planet. Migrants are not damaging economies. Actually, migrants are incredible catalysts to economic activity. They do not drain the public purse. In fact, they contribute more than they receive. Migrants are not disease carriers, and nor are migrants a burden on health services. Again, migrants typically contribute far more than they receive in health services in terms of monetary support, and they are actually healthier than the domestic populations to which they generally migrate. There are some exceptions around mental health issues, and most especially PTSD, from people who have been in situations of profound trauma. But generally speaking, there is absolutely no evidence that migrants are, in fact, are a burden on health services. In fact, the evidence for each of these four myths is overwhelmingly in the opposite direction. So how did we get to the place where we now have 141 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and where the number and the trajectory of increase is virtually exponential, and most especially over the last 5 to 15 years? Well, the world overall, in the last 40 years, we have seen massive increases, in fact, in life expectancy, massive decreases in overall poverty, and massive decreases in overall child mortality. Now, these are, in fact, outcomes that, I think, as human beings, as a collective, we should actually celebrate. And there's a range of other indicators that suggest the same general trend. Now, these are global trends. If you disaggregate regionally and sub-regionally, you will see, in fact, very different patterns. And it's always in the specificity that one finds granularity, and one finds dilemma around the specific versus the general. But this has come at a price. In the last 200 years, what we've seen is massive increases in carbon dioxide emissions, massive ocean acidification, massive increases in fossil fuel energy use. We've seen massive tropical rainforest loss, massive increases in water use, and massive increases in fertilizer use from a planetary perspective. Now, this has had profound impacts in terms of the ecological footprint of the human species on the planet. We're now in what is now widely recognized as the age of the Anthropocene, which is that period of geological, environmental, and biological transformation of the planet by human beings. We are leaving a physical footprint on the planet that will last for billions of years. It will be a layer in that layered sediment that we typically think of when we look at fossils and so on and so on. Our impact is literally altering the very nature of nature, and we are also changing the way that we literally organize ourselves as human beings. There's a massive urbanization taking place over the last 250 years. Where now 52% of the human population lives in cities. If you compare that, just on this graph, if you compare that to 1500, first of all, the world population was only 1 billion in 1500. We're now, just at the other end of the curve, we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 13 years. The degree of urbanization versus, urban versus rural population densities depicted very nicely in this graph. And what you see is a massive switch from rural to urban. And that is taking place just in the last 200 years or so. Now, that's a huge change in how human beings organize themselves. We're now at 52%, and by 2050, we will be 66%. So again, just look at the trajectory of change, both of population increase and of the rate of urbanization. Relevant to this particular talk, not only is that fact, but also that 58% of refugees live in cities. And they don't live in the shiny, glossy, gleamy centers of Ottawa. They live in slums, barrios, and squatter settlements, which actually represent between 50 and 75% of all urban populations totally on a global scale. So what's happening is there's a massive urbanization taking place. The majority of people are actually moving to slums, barrios, and squatter settlements. And refugees and internally displaced people find themselves in those circumstances. So this is really germane, really, really important to understand in terms of how we think of the forces and factors that are driving IDP populations and the emergence of refugees. And this is an example. This is the Kibera slum in Nairobi, and you can see that infrastructure literally just drives through the slums and drives through slums, barrios, and squatter settlements of every major city. One of the questions that I always have when I'm in this kind of situation is we typically think of infectious disease risk, we typically think of massive decreases in population, massive increases in child mortality, and so on. But what we would typically think of and predict, in fact, there are increases in certain infectious diseases, but the question I always have is why isn't it worse? Why do we not see even more major outbreaks of cholera and other waterborne infectious diseases? Why don't we see even more outbreaks of other highly contagious infectious diseases? They're certainly there, but they don't ramify in the way that one would typically expect. So in terms of research and in terms of understanding, that's a crucially important question. And it's one that requires, I think, very, very careful investigation. So great is our impact on the planet that we have now crossed essentially 5 of 9 planetary boundaries. Now, I'm not going to go through these in any great detail, but I can tell you that in terms of climate change, in terms of biological diversity loss, and in terms of the biochemical impact of nitrogen and phosphorus used as fertilizer, these have fundamentally altered ecological planetary boundaries irrevocably. And we are also well on the way, if not already over thresholds around the way in which we use fresh water and also in terms of ocean acidification. And not only have we crossed essentially 5 of 9, but we are well on the way to crossing all 9. And this will have this already is and will have a massive impact on human population, on human society, and on the way in which, again, we live, work, play, and organize ourselves. I've mentioned already that we've seen a 5-fold increase in human population in the last century. And I've mentioned already that we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 13 years. This is profound in terms of the impact on our biosphere and profound in terms of our overall planetary health. And planetary health is a very important, very powerful concept because it speaks to the symbiotic relationship between the biosphere and human civilization. It basically tries to describe a non-linear relationship, but an iterative relationship such that A causes B, which is typically how we think of linearity. A causes B causes C, which causes A. So there's a series of relationships that are iterative. And this is, in fact, it defines the relationship between human civilization and our biosphere. And you can extrapolate from that to varying degrees of complexity to get a much more deep and rich understanding of the relationship between biosphere and human civilization. And this has huge implications for migration and huge implications for the emergence of refugee populations and for internally displaced. I'm going to get into that in a minute. The Global Risk Report, whatever you think of the World Economic Forum, the bottom line is that for the last 15 years, it has put out annually a global risk analysis. And that risk analysis is probably one of the most rigorous and one of the most accurate predictive modeling exercises in terms of risk for the future. What it does is it essentially categorizes risk into 5 categories: economic issues, environmental issues, geopolitical, societal, and technological. And then it tries to map these according to the inputs of both the inputs of experts, but also according using various data sets. And it tries to find probabilities and tries to find clusters of relationship between these various risks. Now, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but you can see the complexity that emerges in the model. Well, what's happened, what they found in the last, the risk analysis for 2019, is that 5 of the top 10 risks for this year are environmental. And they are extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, increased natural disasters, man-made environmental disasters, and massive increases in biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. They've also found that in terms of impact, not just likelihood, but impact, that there are equally 5 of the top 10 are environmental. The other 2 remaining 5 are social, so large-scale involuntary migration and water crises as a consequence of human use of water. So these are recognized as the major risks. They're even more risky than a war, a confrontation between the great powers. They're even more risky and more impactful than, for example, cyber attacks in terms of global geopolitical and economic stability. So this speaks to where we are at in terms of the causes and conditions that create circumstances wherein people migrate and create circumstances wherein people become either refugees or internally displaced. And let me get into that in a little bit more detail. But I think the point here is that complexity, the kind of complexity that's evident here, it indicates, and it very clearly, that there's a very, very high degree of fragility to the circumstances in which human beings have now organized themselves. We're also at a point in human history where we're actually in the 4th industrial revolution. I won't go into the history of revolutions, but we are in the 4th industrial revolution. And that's a revolution that is moving us to think about smart cities and to create the Internet of Things and to restructure the very nature of human economy and the very nature of how we interact with machines and how we interact with our built and physical environment. It is, in fact, it's probably the most transformational of times in human history. And we are in it right now. And yet, we are also in a world where there are 2 worlds. There are those who have access to that new technology and are interacting with it in new and complex ways, who are participants in the Internet of Things, for example. And then there are those who look through the old Apple screen of that old original desktop and who have virtually no access to that and have virtually no power within that emerging social, political, and economic revolution. In fact, there's an abyss, a growing, massive abyss between the North and everybody else. Wealth is growing at an incredible rate in the North. The global economy now is $108 trillion a year. And it's growing at a rate somewhere between 1% and 3%. And that wealth is accumulating in the North. And it's in fewer, even in the North, it's in fewer and fewer and fewer hands. And even in the North, there's a growing divide between those, the uber wealthy, and everyone else. And then there's a massive divide between the North and the rest of the world. And this is the world that we're in. We're in a world where life expectancy in Canada today is 82, in Malawi it's 63. Now, in terms of migration and refugee and IDP populations, I want to just indicate that the institutional framework in which we now find ourselves didn't come out of nowhere. There's a history, and I'm not going to go through this, but I will point out that from 1948 until today, there have been a whole series of institutional architectural constructions and adjustments. And there have been various frameworks that have emerged that try to govern migration and the management of refugee populations. But one of the key things is that architecture, while there has been adjustments, that architecture has not fundamentally changed since the end of World War II, when the international liberal order emerged, the United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions. The architecture was designed for a world of 70 years ago. We are now the second decade of the 21st century, and that architecture is fundamentally the same, and it is no longer fit for purpose. It is almost irrelevant to the world that we actually find ourselves in. The order, the international order that we have so comfortably lived in, that order is in crisis. The international order built and led by the United States primarily, and its partners post-World War II, is in crisis. And this is John Eikenberry, who's one of the gurus of international relations, and those in the room who are political scientists will certainly recognize his name. He's not a man to make rash statements. We also live in a world where the vision of the United Nations, a vision that really post-1955 led to, in French we say, les 30 années glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, of incredible development of institutional architecture internationally, incredible dreams and incredible capacity and wealth and infrastructure dedicated towards development. Now, one can argue, and I have in many cases, that development is just a nice fancy word for post-colonialism. And it is. That's what it is. Let's not be shy. But at the same time, the vision that created the international architecture was one that, at its best, was inspired by really the best of what Western civilization could imagine. A deep and abiding respect for human dignity, a desire to create an architecture of law, of policy, and practice that could incrementally grow an infrastructure and a political system globally wherein the basic dignity of every single human being could be honored and respected, and where the freedom to pursue one's life according to one's religion, to one's philosophy, or one's political ideology was allowed. That vision was a particular vision of power. But today, we have a very different vision of power. We have visions of absolute power that is not rooted in equity, that is not rooted in a commitment to justice, and that is not rooted in a commitment to fairness among human beings. And it's not simply Mr. Trump. We have a rising tide of authoritarian populism around the world. And this is a profound threat to the political order in which we live. Foreign Affairs, in July of last year, put out a special issue asking, which world are we living in? Is it a realist liberal world? Is it a Marxist tribal world? Is it a techno-digital world? Or is it a world of global warming? At the same time, we've seen massive changes in the balance of power and among the great powers. And we see now proxy wars being fought in Yemen, in Syria, in Venezuela. And we see with that a profound flouting of humanitarian norms and international law by those very great powers, and a profound almost disinterest and incapacity at the United Nations, at the Security Council level, to even articulate a demand for basic respect for international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles and practices. And these matter. These matter to the daily lives of people in conflict zones. We see a massive increase in hospitals that are being bombed and attacked, a massive increase in the direct targeting of ambulances, of schools, of cultural sites. We see a massive increase in the direct targeting of humanitarian actors. This is a change, and this is a change that we need to find ways to address. We also live in a world where climate change is very real. This is not a minor factor. And nor is it to be disputed. And I wouldn't even begin to take that on in this room. But it is something that, unfortunately, is still a reality for many, that it is still disputed. It is a scientific fact. There is absolutely no question that anthropogenic activity has caused and is causing and will cause massive changes in our climate. The last 5 years are the hottest on record. And are likely to continue. The probability that we will see ongoing increases in temperature is almost a certainty in the next few years. We see a massive increase as a consequence of climate change in extreme weather events. And I don't need to remind anyone in this room who's a Canadian that in this country we've seen a massive increase in extreme weather events. Dorian, floods, wildfires in Fort McMurray and in British Columbia, the Summer of Smoke, as it's referred to now in the Northwest Territories. The Yellowknife was surrounded by smoke for 85 days in 2014, with profound health impacts on the population, both physical and mental. We also see with natural disasters and with conflict, new displacements. And this is an image from Mozambique following the cyclones this summer. And when we compare the number of people who are displaced because of conflict or disaster, in fact, the largest number of people are displaced now, and increasingly so, because of disaster, of natural disaster associated with extreme weather events. We also see massive increases in water insecurity around the world. This is an image of the Chilwa Basin in Malawi, where I have a research project on that seeks to model the health impacts of climate change. This is the basin. This is an aerial view of the basin, and you can see a lake. And what's happened is the lake has shrunk as a consequence of climate change. And so what we're trying to do is work with communities to understand the complexity of variables around meteorologic change, extreme weather events, food insecurity, infectious disease, and disaster risk reduction and preparedness strategies, so that we can help communities adapt, choose the adaptations that are most effective in maximizing their health in such circumstances. This is just one example, but this is happening all over the world now. We also see massive threats to biodiversity. This is the pine beetle, and you can see here these are the forests of British Columbia. The brown is the dead forest that's been eaten by the pine beetle, and this is one of the sources of massive increases in forest fire. With changes in meteorologic changes, one sees an increased frequency of lightning. And lightning in the context of dry forests like this mean forest fires. Now I show a Canadian example, but this is happening in many parts of the world. Russia, Australia, Asia, Africa. This is the reality of climate change. It's not coming, it's here. And this has massive impacts in terms of migration, in terms of refugee populations, and in terms of internally displaced. This is the leaf here on my left. This is called leaf rot. And this is a fungal disease that affects the coffee plant. The fungus spreads as changes in humidity occur, largely as a function of climate change. This fungus has spread around the world and has decimated coffee crops in Latin America and Central America, and also in East Africa and some parts of Asia. This means then that people lose their livelihoods. This means then that people migrate. The World Bank is suggesting that there will be upwards, and if not more, than 143 million internally displaced migrants because of the effects of climate change. Internally displaced migrants because of the effects of climate change over the next 25 years. We also see complex ecologies and changes in the pattern of re-emerging and emerging infectious diseases. We see there's very good evidence in terms of Ebola and in terms of Zika that ecological change and the relationship and the impingement of human activity in the context of changing ecologies leads to a higher probability of contact with these particular disease-causing agents and leads to a change in vector patterns, which then leads to a change in incidence, prevalence, and spread of certain diseases. And this is certainly the case with Zika and certainly the case for Ebola. We also see massive increases as a consequence of climate change of food insecurity. This little girl, if you look at this little girl, I asked my son last night, how old do you think this little girl is? He said 8. She's 16. This girl is massively stunted. Her growth has been stunted because of prolonged deficits in nutrients over the course of her lifetime. Because she's a girl, in the developing world, most especially, she's even more vulnerable. But this is a circumstance that also occurs among boys, but more frequently among girls. And this is a consequence of prolonged deficits in basic caloric intake and in appropriate nutrition intake. And what we're seeing is that crops are failing in many parts of the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, crops are already failing in the southern region of Africa. There's massive food distribution taking place in Malawi and Mozambique and in some regions of South Africa as a consequence of climate change. And the projections over the next few years are that those crops will fail by as much as 50% because of the impacts of climate change. Now think about what that means. If you cannot feed your children, what will you do? You will go to where you think you can feed your children. I would. I would do anything in such circumstances to feed my children. And I know you would too. And that's what every single human being in that circumstance does. They move. They migrate. They try to find food. Now, this is what is starting to happen now in many parts of the world. In 2017, just a couple of years back, there were 4 famines. 20 million people were affected across Africa. And these are definitively, by meteorologists and definitively ascribed to the consequences of climate change. 20 million people in need of food assistance. In 2011, 500,000 people died in East Africa of starvation. And that is directly attributable to the impacts of climate change. It is here. It is real, and it is forcing changes in the way that human beings live, work, play, migrate, and how we deal with people who are in very, very difficult circumstances. Other big changes globally. Conflict is no longer intrastate, within states, and it's no longer between one state and another, the proximate states, which is the typical yesteryear conception of conflict. Conflict is regional, it's borderless, it's porous, and it has global implications. So conflict in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and across North Africa has led to massive displacement of people in those regions. And the vast majority of those people who were displaced, upwards of 90%, have moved internally or across borders, proximate borders. So the majority of people who are affected remain in those regions. A very small number of people have tried to migrate to distant third countries. And that's what we see. So the European, or the global migration crisis, which many of us think of as a European phenomenon, that's the tip of the iceberg. And what we have witnessed on our television screens over the last 3 to 4 years, tip of the iceberg, in terms of not what is coming, but what is happening now around the world. At the same time, the consequence of this has meant, in many ways, that the core of what a humanitarian is motivated by, which is solidarity with those who are in circumstances wherein they are suffering in a manner considered to be inhuman. The core idea of solidarity with those who suffer, that is being increasingly criminalized, so that aid workers are being arrested for assisting people who are, for example, trying to cross the Mediterranean. Ships are being seized. An MSF ship was seized in Italy 2 years ago on some trumped up public health charge that somehow MSF was emptying the ballasts of this ship illegally in water. And it was a clear effort to shut the ship down. That's what is now happening. That in the context as well of massive violations of international humanitarian law, norms and practices in other contexts. It's a shift. It's a major change in terms of what humanitarianism is and what it means in terms of practice and what it means in terms of its normative value for policy. So this is just a map that shows displacements by conflict and disaster in 2017, and for 2018 it's roughly the same. There are some minor changes, but the Venezuelan refugee crisis is one that I would like to highlight because it's one that we kind of know a little bit about, but we don't know too much about. Venezuela is in the midst of one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world today, if not the biggest. There are already 4 million refugees of a population of 21 million, people who crossed the border from Venezuela. And by the end of this year, that would be 6 million. And in fact, there are some surveys that have just been completed in the last few weeks that some of the methodologies are still not fully scrutinized. But the surveys that have been completed in the last few weeks suggest that we're already at 6 million Venezuelan refugees who've crossed borders. Visa requirements have been imposed regionally. Some countries have lifted visa requirements. Canada, Spain, and in some circumstances, under very particular conditions, the United States has also done that. And Colombia, a neighboring state, is actually granting citizenship to children of refugee parents who are born in Colombia. So this is a massive, massive crisis. And it's fundamentally, in the first instance, it's a political crisis. And I won't go into the politics of what's happening, but this is a geopolitical crisis where the great powers are deeply involved, the United States and Russia, deeply, deeply involved in Venezuela. And the way in which refugee and humanitarian issues are broached in such broached in such circumstances is deeply influenced by the presence or absence and interests of great powers. We're also seeing, and I've just tried to put all that together, we're seeing a worsening dynamic between war and displacement, food insecurity, and re-emerging infectious diseases. And I point to Syria as a good example. This is a paper that was published in Nature, and a paper that analyzed systematically, using computer-based modeling and a whole series of other very complex methodologies, that analyzed systematically the relationship between drought, climate change-driven drought in northern Syria, and the subsequent emergence of civil war. Essentially, in a nutshell, drought meant crop failure. The ethnic minorities who lived in the north moved in search of food, moved to urban areas, destabilizing the political balance of power in the towns and villages and communities to which they were seeking refuge, which destabilized Mr. Assad's brutal, frankly, hold on power, and which led then to the eruption of civil war and to a global humanitarian crisis. The G7 has recognized that climate change is a force multiplier in terms of conflict and displacement, that there already is and will be increased conflict over natural resources and increased conflict over decreasing food production yields, and that rising sea levels will affect somewhere between 17 and 216 million people, and that this will also this can destabilize the political stability within nation states, and particularly so in fragile nation states where governance is tenuous. The other major factor that I really want to point out, and that I've identified previously, is that the architecture and the functionality of the humanitarian system that was created 70 years ago, that system is in crisis. It's at a breaking point. And those are the words of the Red Cross, not my words. It is fundamentally at a breaking point. And the question is, can it be modernized? Can it be updated? And these are really important questions, research questions and policy questions for some of the people here in the room. And I put it to you that there's a fundamental responsibility to really think about this and engage these questions in critical and pragmatic ways. Just to give you an idea, in terms of funding, from 2017 to 2018, the gray line is the requested funding for UN agencies, somewhere around 48 billion, and the black line is the actual delivered funding for UN agencies. And remember the context and how that has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. The context has changed, the needs are increasing, and yet there's a massive discrepancy between requested funds and actual funds. And what this means then is that UN agencies like World Food Program, UNICEF, UNDP, OCHA, that they're actually having to cut their programs or to deliver even less and less humanitarian assistance. So the world that we're in is what is described as a VUCA world. By futurists and those who engage in risk analysis. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. This is reality. The top risks that I've already described in some detail, 5 of them are environmental, 2 are deal with social issues and how human beings respond to particular circumstances, water crises and mass migration. These are the top risks for the next 10 years. So let me just kind of pull it all together. So we are actually in the middle of a protection crisis for IDP, internally displaced people, and for refugees. Complexity reflects is another way of describing, or another way of framing the fragility of the variables that I've tried to illuminate here. It's extremely important that we try not to be simplistic in terms of how we think about the complexity of the kind of world that I've described. We typically want to be simplistic because it gives us a handle. It gives us something to hold on to. We like to compartmentalize into definable, discrete boxes. And our thinking and our research and our policy strategies are typically siloed and contained within those boxes. But then in practice, you confront complexity. So I think one of the challenges here is to not be simplistic. Everything, Einstein once said, and one of the most beautiful phrases I've ever heard, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simplistic. This is how we understand more closely and approximate our approach to reality. It's extremely important. And I think the strategy in terms of how we engage policy, practice, and research, it really must be about critical, informed pragmatism. It must be about what can we do concretely to help people in the most difficult of circumstances. What can we do concretely to try to change the dynamic, to influence the normative values, to influence the political dialogue, to influence the way in which issues are framed from a global and at a local level. And doing so from a deeply informed, critical, pragmatic perspective. I think this is the strategy that I am taking in some of my work and with faculty and fellows at York and elsewhere. The protection crisis, the response of the world has been the creation of a global compact for migration and the global compact for refugees, which was promoted and then accepted at Marrakesh in 2018. Canada is a signatory to both, and that's really a good thing. But these are frameworks, global frameworks. They are non-binding legally, and as we all know internationally, there is no, in fact, enforcement capacity. But normatively, these are extremely important. And they can help guide national and international policy and initiatives around migration and also around refugees and internally displaced. I also say that in the spirit of concrete and critical pragmatism, humanitarians need to continue to engage in solidarity with the people they seek to help. One of the things that has happened over the last 15 or so years is an increase in what euphemistically people within the humanitarian sector call remote control humanitarian assistance. Because of the change in the nature of conflict, because of the increased risk associated with expatriate humanitarian aid workers and a flouting of international humanitarian law and so on, there's less and less expatriate aid workers present in situations of conflict or crisis. And there's more remote control programming. Now, this is really, really, in my view, a real threat to the idea and to the practice and experience of solidarity, which is really the essence. It's the beginning and, in many ways, the end of what humanitarianism is. Humanitarianism is not a substitute for politics, and it's not simply a series of material transactions where you give food, you give shelter, you give water. It is about being with other human beings who are in the most egregious of circumstances and doing whatever you can, practically and functionally, to alleviate suffering where it's possible to do so. That's the essence of humanitarianism. It's not a substitute for political action. It's not a substitute for institutions that are effective in terms of appropriate delivery of public goods and so on. So what this means then is that very practically, there are better tools that we need to develop around water and sanitation, around healthcare technologies, that can be more effectively defined to deal with some of the impacts of climate change. I'll just give you one example. One of the things that we're working on at York is water optimization. So we're combining digital platforms, artificial intelligence, and biosensors. We're combining those three technologies so that we're able to identify pathogenic contamination of water in refugee camps and IDP settings and in urban environments where refugees are present. We're able to identify pathogenic contamination of water and then predict and prescribe specifically via mobile phone to a particular person with a particular size bucket that may be this big or this big, exactly how much chlorine to put in your bucket to deal with that pathogenic contamination. And you can just extrapolate. You can say that you can apply the same algorithms, the same tools to a 200,000-liter bladder tank for the Rohingya in Bangladesh, where water optimization is a real problem. So better, more practical tools can be developed. As well, the nature of humanitarian assistance toward those in need has really shifted from commodity-based to cash-based. So instead of giving food, you give cash. It's not a perfect shift. There's still there's still a need for food assistance in many cases, but probably the most effective thing is cash. And where does that come from? It actually comes, the vast majority of cash doesn't come from nation states. It doesn't come from, and the vast majority of humanitarian assistance doesn't come from nation states or from NGOs. It comes from family members. It comes from diasporic populations who are sending money home to help their family at home. Now, one of the big issues there is cash transfer fees. Upwards of 28% of every dollar that's transferred overseas goes to banking fees. That's huge. So there are technologies that can be and are being developed around use of blockchain, for example, to reduce transaction costs to less than 1% so that even more money gets to families in need. So these are very practical things that can have massive impacts. As well, risk management and partnerships with other NGOs and faith-based groups. One of the biggest changes over the last 15 years is that faith-based groups, Muslim and other, are much more active and much more present in their communities in terms of delivering humanitarian assistance and care. So non-government organizations, UN agencies, and governments need to find better ways to work together with local groups, and most especially with faith-based groups in situations of conflict, because they're actually a really growing and highly effective provider of assistance in their own communities. And then finally, I think there are some major challenges around looking at humanitarian history, humanitarian policy, and practice historically, to really understand the nature of that architecture and really understand how that has changed and why it has changed, with a view to understanding how to make significant contributions to what a future architecture could look like. And this, I think, will emerge, that architecture will emerge not through declaration or some great, on high sort of statement from the great, Ivy Tower. It will emerge through practice. It will emerge through experimentation. And so examining the history, the policy, and practice of humanitarianism and humanitarian architecture is something I would really encourage you to do, but in partnership with practitioners. Therein, practical, high probability solutions can be defined and then tested. And then finally, there are very practically some alternative humanitarian pathways. Most governments offer some form of temporary protection. Governments sometimes offer visitor visas, but there are now what are called humanitarian visas, and there are many different types. And I don't want to kind of get into it in any detail, but there are some that essentially give residence to a refugee or a person who has crossed their border. And this is really what you see in Mexico, and that's really a consequence of Mr. Trump putting a lot of pressure on the Mexican government to limit the flow of people coming through Mexico to the American border. Turkey also has a form of humanitarian visa, but that's deeply tied to income, money from the European Union. And I'm sure many in the room are aware of the threats that Turkey has made to the European Union, and threats that the European Union has made to Turkey around either funds from the EU to Turkey, or from Turkey, the cessation of humanitarian visas. The kind of visas that are worthy of exploration and really do require some careful thought and careful engagement from legal scholars, policy analysts, and others are visas that can give people entry to a third-party country like Canada when those people are most vulnerable or without protection in the state to which they have crossed. This is something that I think needs to be explored. And again, it needs to be explored with good scholarly engagement, but also in a very practical way with practitioners and with the people, obviously, who are in those circumstances, so that we can actually test these ideas and see what works and what doesn't work. And with that, I'm going to close. I have touched on a number of issues, a whole range of issues that influence migration, that influence the emergence of refugee populations, and that influence the emergence of internally displaced people. We have an extensive research program that we're undertaking at York University around these issues, and I just want to show you, this is one of the people that is involved in that research initiative around forced migration, transnational networks, climate politics, and access to health care for migrants, refugees, and internally displaced. And if anyone is interested in pursuing a deeper understanding, deeper relationship on some of the things that we're thinking about, please contact either me or Lynn. Thank you very much.
Wow. I might need a couple minutes to collect myself after that one. Thank you so much, Dr. Orbinski. You know, the series that we host is called Big Thinking, and sometimes you see somebody who has no trouble stepping up and even exceeding the standard that sets. And to hear a discussion that covers so many issues from so many perspectives is really what we strive to do. It's interesting hearing that kind of talk given by a physician or someone who's an expert in health research, because I think in a way that there are characteristics that you can bring to this conversation that are very powerful. And I'm thinking specifically of someone who cares very deeply and someone who is going to give it to you straight. And I think that's what I would want in a doctor. And I think at this time when we're hearing really a diagnosis on the state of the planet and of humanity, it's those same attributes we need. And I think if there's anything in terms of inspiration or encouragement that I take from it, it is in the words that you said, not to be simplistic, because I think we know in our hearts that this is a very complex world and it's a very complex moment in more than one sense of that word. And if anything frightens us, it's the idea that we can't face up to that complexity. And I think today's discussion showed us that there are definitely people among us who can. And I applaud both you, Dr. Orbinski, and everyone here who decided to spend a sunny afternoon facing some uncomfortable truths with us today. Now, we are in part two, which is going to be a chance to have a bit of a conversation with Dr. Orbinski. I'm going to introduce a very special guest to help lead that conversation. And then shortly after that, there'll be a chance for people to socialize at the reception. So I think we can, I might even loosen my tie. Let me introduce the moderator for this afternoon's discussion, Dr. Nadia Abuzara. She is an associate professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa and chair in Women's Studies at Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. She is also a former member of the Federation's Board of Directors. Dr. Abuzara is a member of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa and is co-director of the project Community Mobilization in Crisis, a collaboration between the University of Ottawa and the American University of Beirut, working to enhance the resilience and strength of refugee and host communities through community mobilization. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Abuzara to moderate this session, first by asking Dr. Orbinski some questions of her own, and then opening the conversation for all of you to ask your own. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abuzara.
Nice to meet you. So I had lots of grumpy questions prepared.
I like those.
And I'm just going to set them aside to ask a very simple question, which is, in your many travels, about which documentaries have been named after you. You know, this is, I think, how do I say this? You've been around the world and back, and I'd like to ask you a moment where you felt you drew inspiration from where you have been. From a moment, and I'll give you a moment to think about it, but a moment where you drew inspiration before I hit you with the grumpy questions.
I can't wait for the grumpy ones. Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and what I've seen over and over and over again is when people are in circumstances where they take pragmatic actions to address their needs. That's how we move forward, right? It's not about sort of meta-philosophical debates and discussions. These are extremely important. I'm not in any way minimizing. Political philosophy, for example, really matters. It matters in terms of how we think and frame and so on. But ultimately, when one engages in critical pragmatism, I've seen that time and time and time again. Not through organizations, I've certainly seen it in organizations, but I've seen it time and time again among the individuals and communities that I've worked with and continue to work with. And I think that's one of the most profound sources of inspiration for me, that you just got to get on with it, right? And you've got to feed your kids. You've got to deal with this circumstance. We're here, we're now. It's messy, it's complex, it's imperfect. You've just got to get on with it. And what drives you? It's commitment to your family, to your community, and get moving. So I find that incredibly powerful.
Is there one you would give me connected, for example, to your work in water, one connected to health, one connected to education?
Well, sure. I mean, the Goma crisis in, I think it was 1994, after the genocide in Rwanda. There were millions of people, Rwandans, who had crossed the border into Zaire, or then Zaire, now the DRC. And millions of people without any shelter, any accommodation to their basic needs. And cholera emerged very quickly. The response of local churches and communities in the Congo and in Goma particularly was very practical. It was to seek out people who were sick, isolate them. They had very little knowledge and very little resources, but they knew enough to do that. Right? And that was highly effective, at least initially, in identifying, first of all, the emergence of an epidemic that soon became quite serious. And then also it was an initiative to which others like MSF, the Red Cross, and many, many others could actually add value to. That's just an example. But I think to the extent that if you miss that, if you miss seeing that individuals and communities wish to act for their own benefit and for their own well-being, if you miss seeing that and if you miss enabling that, then you're really missing an incredible opportunity to have a massive and significant impact. So.
I hear you. I feel I should move on to the grumpy questions, but I just want to continue in the same vein.
Go grumpy.
So I did warn you I would ask this question, which is that when you're in an international environment, you're not with your 2 feet in Toronto or wherever it may be, and you find, to your chagrin, that the country from which you're coming or where your parents may have come from or elsewhere is actually partly to blame for what you're seeing right in front of your eyes. There could be something involved with British Petroleum. I won't name any Canadian firms. I don't know who your sponsors are today. But, and I presume all of them are completely ethical, which is you pre-screen them and all the rest. So have you ever found that you somehow feel implicated, that you're somehow part of what is responsible for this, or not you personally, but a place close to your heart? And if so, what did you do about it? So I'm going to call that your backyard. Did you ever find that the thing you thought you were fighting so far away was in fact so closely related to your backyard? And if so, what did you do about it?
Well, so I think the simplest example would be pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical access to medicines and the HIV epidemic. It was pretty obvious that one of the main reasons that people in the late 90s weren't getting access to antiretrovirals was because Western pharmaceutical companies, which were and are still among the biggest in the world, were pricing antiretrovirals beyond an accessible level. And in 1998, for example, there were, I believe it was about 50,000 people in the West who needed access to antiretrovirals, or who had been identified at that particular period, 1998, I think it was, as likely to benefit from antiretrovirals. At the same time, there were 500,000 people of exactly the same criteria medical criteria in the developing world who didn't have a hope in hell of getting those medicines because their governments couldn't afford them, and they were priced beyond any realm of possibility. And so basically, these pharmaceutical companies wanted to give charity and little donations, and we care about people with AIDS in Rwanda or South Africa, and here's a little money for run your clinic, and gee, it's too bad the medicine's so expensive and so on. Well, we essentially started a campaign that changed the face of the AIDS epidemic by openly and very critically, in the first instance, understanding the nature of the phenomenon, understanding what were the pricing conditions, what were the R&D costs, what were the marketing costs, and so on, understanding the structure of the global pharmaceutical industry, and then challenging it directly around intellectual property rights, and challenging individual companies directly on their specific policies around very particular antiretrovirals. And over a very short period of time, less than 3 years, in fact, the price fell, was driven down from a price around $12,500 a year US for antiretrovirals to less than $200 for generic versions of the same medicines. And there were other things that we did. We essentially pooled the purchasing power of MSF, which at that time was quite significant. It's even more significant now. But we pooled that purchasing power and essentially cornered the market on pharmaceutical raw materials for antiretrovirals, and drove down the price of generic antiretrovirals, and at the same time ensured guaranteed purchasing with a number of specific companies so that we could maintain a drug supply, grow a drug supply of generics, and then maintain a pricing, an appropriate price point on those generics. But that was a confrontation of Western pharmaceutical industry, of Western governments that were deeply in bed with the pharmaceutical industry and deeply connected, if you will, to the material interests of the pharmaceutical industry. And we did that in a very clear, systematic, rational, evidence-based manner that recognized as well, and just give you a little more detail on it, that recognized the power of social movements, right? And structured that campaign as a global social movement. And that was, that's what we did.
It's exactly that non-traditional, phenomenal approach that I think makes Médecins Sans Frontières, your work, and that particular campaign so unusual and yet so remarkable, because the impact just sounds so profound of a campaign rather than, as you said, a charitable donation of a few pharmaceuticals. I want to turn the floor over to those of you here and to suggest that perhaps we take a number of questions at a time.
Sure.
If you want to write, I can pass the pen that I had at the table we had.
I have one here.
If that's all right. He has a pen. Critical pragmatism at work.
Dr. Orbinski, thank you very much for a stimulating and enlightening and sobering lecture. One of the ethos of the Academy of Health Sciences is that we have a social contract. And because of the privilege that we've had to work in this country, we should be giving back. So the question is, as one thinks, for example, about cash and about giving back to organizations, whether it be climate or oceans or MSF or the Red Cross, do you have a point of view as to which organizations and which purposes associated with this complex environment that you've articulated are most deserving? And what advice would you give us?
Yeah, so I would, you talked about social contract, I would just sort of step back a little bit and suggest that, sorry?
Should we take the second question?
Sure, but let me just answer this.
Sure.
there's a social contract between the academy and society. There's a social contract between the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences and society. And that I think, is the first place where we should be thinking about how what we choose to research, what we choose to do with our profound place of privilege in these academies, in universities, in research institutions. I think we should really be thinking very profoundly about what is the nature of that contract, of that obligation. What are the questions that we choose to research? How do we choose to research? Are we engaged, and according to the framework that I've really tried to present here, I hope, in a way that actually communicates, in a context that really demands critical pragmatism. What is the nature of that social contract? And I think that's a personal reflection for each of us, but I also think it's an institutional reflection. So universities, the role of universities, for example, in societies, has been relatively stable over the last 1,200 years. It has had a very particular kind of place. That is potentially changing. I don't know if it is really, I don't know. This is what you should be thinking about. I think what some of us here in this room should be thinking about. And why is it changing? And is it changing for the good? Is it changing in honor of that inherent social contract that creates these incredible places of privilege and power where curiosity and knowledge can be pursued with purpose? What is the purpose? Is it to enhance society? Is it to enhance individual members of society or individual entities within society? Is the overall good being properly served? And I really think that is a very important question. I also think it's an important question that we recognize that charity can never be a substitute for effective public policy. Charity, by definition, is voluntary. Effective public policy is about the nature, structure, purpose, and intent of a society. Right? So effective public policy requires public resources and or mechanisms, publicly mandated mechanisms that allow for the realization of a good. Charity is not a substitute for effective public policy. Now that said, and just as I said in my lecture, humanitarianism has in my view, it has a very particular meaning. It's not a substitute for government. It's not a substitute for the provision of goods, either through the private sector or through public goods, either through the private sector or through the state. It's not a substitute. It's a necessary, in my view, a necessary action, and it requires the state or society must allow for humanitarianism to exist, but it's not in itself a substitute for the practical pursuit of the good. Now that said, there are organizations that I think are really good, and I would say that it's important also to recognize, that many organizations are in fact not truly independent, right? They're not truly self-governing entities. They are in fact, by virtue of how they're financed and so on, they're effectively parastatal institutions. They're implementing partners of a particular government policy or a particular government's overseas development assistance policy. There are some that are truly independent, and I think it's pretty obvious which ones I have allied myself with. And I've allied myself with MSF, for example, and the Red Cross for very particular reasons. And the two main reasons are three main reasons. One, critical pragmatism. Number two, a culture of debate, a culture of free inquiry, and a culture where excellence is the goal. And then number three, independence, where it is able to make its own decisions according to its debate and according to its rigorous engagement and inquiry of a particular issue, it's able to make its own decisions and its own actions. So it's a very long answer, but it's one that avoids the simplicity that is sometimes inherent in, oh, give to MSF, or give to, World Vision, or give to IRC, or don't give to, X, Y, Z.
Thank you very much for an excellent and very forceful presentation. I decided to write my question to keep my words limited. So I have a preamble and then a question. The preamble is related to what you've been talking about. You've actually been telling us a lot about conflict and migration and the refugees in the traditional, conventional sense of kinetic conflict. You raised also the issue of the emergent issue of climate change and refugees. So my question then is, in your case, can you share your views about how climate change will create a new scale of conflict and human suffering? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough question to take on in this context where evidence and rigor are really core to a methodological approach to a particular issue. I think I just look at the evidence that's in front of us in terms of the trajectory of climate change, and I look at the evidence that's in front of us in terms of food insecurity, changing patterns of infectious disease, and changing migration patterns. And I think one can look with foresight to the future, which is by definition imperfect in terms of how we understand it. But I think you can look at the future and you can say that we are only going to see massive increases in terms of impacts around extreme weather events, risk of infectious disease, food insecurity, and changes to the nature of how human beings organize themselves. If you look at the science of climate, if you look at the impact of greenhouse gases on meteorologic systems, what's clear is that our best models, first of all, have profoundly underestimated the speed and the impact of massive increases in greenhouse gas emissions, the speed and impact of that increase on extreme weather. And it's also clear that there's a lag period between when we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and when we will see the impact of those reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We've actually doubled our greenhouse gas emissions since I believe it's the 1990s. I'd have to check the actual number. But we've doubled our greenhouse gas emissions, and we've already passed critical thresholds in terms of parts per billion. 350.org was founded on the idea that the critical threshold is 350. We're already at 404, and we're increasing still because of the failure of the Paris Agreement and the failure of many states to actually limit and reduce their greenhouse gases. So what that means then is that we are, at least for the next 30 years, even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, globally, for the next 30 years, we're going to see massive increases in extreme weather events, food insecurity, infectious diseases, and other impacts. So that doesn't bode well for the future, but I'm not, I'm not, first of all, the only one who recognizes this. But I don't want to sort of end the question on such a negative note. I am actually quite optimistic about human beings' ability to adapt, and quite optimistic about our ability to adapt, particularly in crisis. We can learn very quickly as human societies, and I'm quite optimistic that we will find new ways of governance, new ways of engaging these issues, new technologies, new systems of interacting that can reduce and ameliorate impacts. So
if you don't mind, I wanted to let you know that in order to have time for the reception, that this would be the last round of questions. So if you do have a question, please find your way to a microphone. We'll take the questions, and then there'll be some closing remarks. Thank you.
I'm happy to hear you're optimistic, because I must say that your extraordinary presentation was not always easy to hear. It's difficult. You mentioned at the beginning of your conference that there was an increase in world population of 1 billion folks every decade. And when mentioning the list of risks, demography was not one of them. And I was wondering if there was a reason for that. What's your explanation to mentioning demography and then not speaking about it for the rest of the presentation? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. So there's two parts to that, two answers, two pieces to the answer. One is in response to your, oh, sorry, did you want to ask a question?
Sure, and it's partly related to that. First, two comments. The 258 million figure that you quoted about migrants, that's a stock figure, not a flow figure. That's everybody alive today living outside their country of birth. That's
I'm sorry,
me.
I didn't
That's everybody alive today living outside their country of birth. The 258 million figure. That includes me. I moved to Canada 22 years ago. So I think it was somewhat misrepresented in suggesting that 258 million is a flow figure when it's a stock figure. And then on the demography, the other thing that didn't come out is that population growth rates, the big story is how much they're decreasing. So the population's growing, but at a decreasing rate. And the UN's recently revised all its projections downward because the rate is going down quicker than they thought. So my comment is that I think there's a risk in those numbers in kind of scaring people, and I think part of the populist reaction is misunderstanding what the numbers mean and what the trends are. My question is a more specific one, and you asked it yourself but left it largely rhetorical, and it was about Kibera.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not really understanding what you're saying.
Okay, about Kibera, the slum.
Yeah.
And the question that you asked rhetorically was, why are things not worse? And I'd like to push you on why you think things aren't worse when, by all logic, they might be. So are there optimistic things that you can find in that explanation that we can draw from as humanitarians?
Okay, good. Okay, well, let me deal with that first. So the numbers that I quoted are based on the Lancet Commission on Migration. And whether you characterize them as stock or flow, that's not the language that the Lancet Commission used. So I'm not going to try to reinterpret it in terms of stock and flow. But what I presented is a core piece of the evidentiary base for the Lancet Commission, which was formulated and released after a 2-year process to coincide with the Marrakesh Agreement. So there may be some variances in terms of how those numbers are interpreted and what they mean, but I'm going to defer to the Lancet, not to my own interpretation of those numbers. That's the first thing. And then in terms of demography and population growth, I am eagerly anticipating UN reformulations of population projections. And there are many people who like you, anticipate that those projections may be modified. And I don't know which way they'll go, but there will be a re-examination of projections. But what I presented and the numbers I used are current public projections. And so I'm going to stand by that as well. in terms of some of the other issues or questions that were raised, I would say that yes, my talk was not necessarily the most happy and pleasant talk, but I think it's important that we see reality as it is, not as we would like it to be, and that we then engage in critical inquiry and engage in critical pragmatism that seeks the kind of solutions and interventions that can be effective in addressing some of these issues. In terms of population growth, there are many issues. In fact, all of the issues that I presented, with the exception of water, I didn't actually explore any of the interventions or any of the potential adaptations that are in fact underway. But in terms of population growth, the evidence is pretty clear that the single most effective intervention that reduces population growth in a consistent and long-standing way across generations is women's education or girls' education. There are many very good studies that have looked at this issue, and that typically is what I would, personally, I would very much support from a global public policy perspective in terms of addressing population growth. And I think I've covered everything.
Thank you. I'll say a few things and then I'll pass the floor over to Gabriel. When I listen to what you're saying and when I see the larger picture, which sometimes I don't sit back and I don't necessarily think about climate change on a daily basis. It's not part of my quotidian activities. But I think that by being able to listen with you, to share some of what your insights are after having seen the microcosm and bringing it out to the macrocosm, it allows us to see things like the irony of places in deep poverty without the income required to pay for medications that are simultaneously in deep wealth. Some of those locations that you listed are known as the resource wealthiest countries in the world, and we include the fourth world. We include those nations who don't have autonomy of not only things like education, health, and the way they wish to self-govern, but also things like resources that can fund that self-government, that self-determination. And so the great irony is that you've not only traversed places of deep crisis, but also places of either prior wealth or ongoing potential wealth, where that wealth is not leveraged for the well-being of those who are there, which is where you refer to development as an extension of post-colonialism, and where you refer to proxy wars, where people who are essentially fueling the wars are quietly unaware that a war is being fought on our behalf for what goes into cell phones and so on and so forth. And it's that macrocosm that helps us remember and reflect that this isn't just about one child, about one situation, about one circumstance. It's about our daily choices, our consumption choices, and so on. What you bring, I think, are two lessons, and one of them is that not only do we look forward to the new, but we also look back, if you want to call it the old, or you call it the ancient, but there are knowledges, there are systems that we need to refresh or learn for the first time if we've never known them, that we can better understand how to move forward, not only from the new, but also from better understanding the traditions and the knowledges that have been there for as long as people can remember. And that second lesson that I think we can all draw, you called it solidarity. I'm, for the purposes of just now, going to call it allyship, is that it's not about heroes flying in with capes. It's about allyship. It's about everyone being able to think of their own situation, both as someone who can be in crisis at any moment, and someone who can be in allyship with someone else in crisis at any moment. We undergo our own crises. We try to be allies in other people's crises. You know, as individuals, I'm not talking about all of us in the room, but as individuals, we all go through our crises, and we're all going to stand with someone else when that other person, when that other nation is in crisis. And that is what I think your life's work demonstrates so beautifully. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So first, I just want to thank Dr. Orbinski and Dr. Abuzara for that conversation, allowing us to kind of interact and digest some of what you helped us see in the first half of today's session. We usually do these lectures in the morning, early in the morning in Ottawa, but it's really nice, I think, today to be able to leave and spend some time socializing, maybe have a drink, and reflect together on some of what we've heard. I'm not going to stand between you and that opportunity for much longer. Let me just say the following. I want to thank you both again. I want to thank the staff and leadership of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. I want to thank all of you for your willingness to share what you do and your conversations with a broader community, and bringing a speaker here who is so good at facilitating and catalyzing that conversation. I want to thank our very good friends at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, including their president, Ted Hewitt, who is here today. I want to thank my team, which includes several new members who jumped straight into the fire and helped pull together what I think was an outstanding event. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you, and have a wonderful evening.